World War II entered history as the most monumental and devastating conflict humanity has ever endured. It mobilized entire nations, redirected economies, and dragged millions of soldiers into a struggle that stretched across continents. Among the countless types of military equipment deployed in that colossal confrontation, tanks became one of the most recognizable and symbolic instruments of war. Armored, relentless, and mass-produced in numbers never seen before, they turned into both a tool of destruction and a symbol of national strength. But any war, even a total war like World War II, eventually comes to an end. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the victorious nations were faced with an unexpected challenge: what to do with the enormous arsenal that had outlived its immediate purpose. Warehouses, repair depots, and forward bases were overflowing with armored vehicles. The Soviet Union found itself in possession of tens of thousands of tanks, many of which had never even fired a shot by the time the fighting stopped. Understanding what happened to them reveals much more than just logistical decisions. It tells the story of the early Cold War and the global balance of power that shaped the second half of the 20th century. World War II was not merely a clash of armies. It was a trial of ideologies, intelligence systems, industrial might, and societal resilience. For the Soviet Union, the decisive factor was not only battlefield bravery, but also the outcome of an immense economic struggle. And in that struggle, the USSR demonstrated a surprising and often underestimated superiority. Although the Lend-Lease program from the United States did contribute valuable resources, few realized that a significant portion of the deliveries arrived only after the Soviet Union had already turned the tide in 1943 during the so-called Great Breakthrough. Washington had no intention of supplying a nation that might collapse and allow American weapons to fall into Nazi hands. Yet despite early catastrophes in 1941, Soviet industry recovered and surpassed expectations, ultimately outproducing the combined economies of Central Europe in the sectors that mattered most for total war. A revealing detail comes from a little-known 1945 report written by former SS Colonel, later General, Ike Middledorf at the request of U.S. military intelligence. His task was to assess the Red Army as a potential future adversary in case a Third World War ever erupted. Middledorf concluded that defeating the USSR in a prolonged conflict would be virtually impossible as long as its industrial centers remained intact. He identified the failure of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans' inability to swiftly seize or destroy Soviet industrial facilities, as one of the key reasons for Germany's collapse. By the end of the war, the Red Army possessed roughly 60,000 tanks of various models, including vehicles supplied by Allied nations. The legendary T-34 alone numbered over 35,000 units, an industrial feat unmatched by any army before or since. So the question arises, what happened to all this armored might once the war ended? Surprisingly, the Soviets did not disarm. They couldn't afford to. The Cold War was already taking shape. In 1945, Winston Churchill authorized the creation of a highly classified plan codenamed Operation Unthinkable, which envisioned a sudden attack on the USSR using Britain, the United States, and even rearmed German divisions, supplemented, incredibly, by German POWs. The plan included the possible use of newly developed American nuclear weapons. However, the rapid buildup of Soviet forces in Eastern Europe rendered the plan militarily unrealistic. Even in a scenario where atomic bombs struck Soviet cities, the Red Army retained the ability to overrun European airfields from which American bombers operated. And on the Far Eastern Front, Soviet forces had just crushed the remnants of the Japanese Guandong Army, eliminating Japan's last military hope. Tanks, in a sense, prevented the Cold War from turning into World War III before it even began. Another misunderstood point concerns Japan's surrender. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are widely believed to have forced Japan to capitulate, but in reality, the decisive factor was the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and the destruction of the Guandong Army. The Japanese leadership understood that the loss of their last major army eliminated any possibility of negotiating favorable terms. The atomic attacks, while shocking, were largely a political demonstration aimed at the USSR. By spring 1945, Most of Japan's industrial centers had already been obliterated by American conventional bombing long before the nuclear strikes. So instead of being scrapped or abandoned, Soviet tanks continued to serve extensively after the war. Large armored groups remained stationed in Eastern Europe and the Far East. Vehicles that became mechanically unreliable during combat were gradually recycled throughout the war, while those that remained mobile, though no longer combat effective, were repurposed for agricultural use. Many T-34s spent their post-war years plowing fields, towing machinery, or serving as the mechanical backbone of struggling collective farms. Meanwhile, the best-preserved tanks were placed into storage for future conflicts. As decades passed, newer Soviet tank models replaced the wartime ones. Some obsolete vehicles were dismantled for scrap metal. Others were shipped to Soviet allies in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, where they participated in new regional conflicts. And a surprisingly large number eventually found their final resting place on pedestals and memorial sites across the Soviet Union, silent steel monuments reminding citizens of the war that shaped their world. But here's the real question. If another global crisis erupted today, would the world once again discover that old machines and forgotten arsenals still have a role to play? Or maybe you think all of this is just outdated Cold War paranoia? Go ahead, prove me wrong in the comments. I'm ready for a real debate.